What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're here to talk some Dynasty Fantasy Football, and more specifically, we're going to pull up the ADP over the first 10 rounds of Dynasty Startup Drafts, and I will show you every single player that I own in those first 10 rounds. We'll talk a little bit about them and see who I roster the most of in my Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues, and maybe see some takeaways from why I roster these players or how I roster these players across my league format. So with that being said, we got a lot of information to talk about today. Let's not waste too much time. Let's just hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these players. So let's kick it off by starting in the first round of Dynasty Startups right now. As you guys can see on the screen right here, these are the players that I currently rostered that are being drafted within the first round. So we have a couple quarterbacks, mostly a lot of quarterbacks, because my strategy for the most part is to get one of those elite quarterbacks in the first rounds of my Dynasty Startups because I play in all super flex leagues and I love to get those elite QBs. So we have some Josh Allen, some Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Caleb Williams. We even have a Justin Jefferson share. Obviously, I had to have a Justin Jefferson share on one of my teams, but really nothing crazy here aside from the fact that I have a ton of quarterbacks. Now, moving on to the second round of startups, you guys see we kind of continue that theme just a little bit, except we have now kind of dipped into a tier where we have some Amon-Ra St. Brown, we have some Bijan Robinson, some Jahmyr Gibbs, Kyler Murray, Trevor Lawrence. I actually have 2 shares of Gibbs and 2 shares of Lawrence, which is 50% of my exposure right there. I will say the Jahmyr Gibbs exposure and the Bijan Robinson exposure, that came from Dynasty rookie drafts last year. So I drafted those elite running backs in my rookie drafts. I did not draft them at startup prices, but you guys see we still have them nonetheless. Now, oftentimes in my startup drafts, what I like to do is I like to get 2 of the elite quarterbacks. I know I just mentioned that I like to get 1 of them. I really like to get 2 of them. So if I can, getting guys like Kyler Murray in the second round, that is definitely something that I want to do. Trevor Lawrence, not necessarily a guy that I am very high on, but I think his value is pretty low right now. And I think that if he does see a bump in production this year, there could be room for some value growth. So kind of trying to buy a little bit lower on Trevor Lawrence in a couple places. And also it's part of kind of having Trevor Lawrence and him failing. And now I don't want to sell out low as well. So maybe some cost fallacy, but I think for the most part, there is room for improvement with a guy like Trevor Lawrence. Now, in my Dynasty startups, I'm probably not drafting these RBs in this second round with the startup draft. But like I said, in the rookie drafts, when you can get these guys, that's when you have to take those shots. And that's what I did in this roster. But let's move on here to the third round. The third round, you'll see a couple of other things as well. The first one being Sam Laporta. Now, this Sam Laporta share was also drafted in my rookie draft. I think I got Sam Laporta in like the 3rd round. So this is a major increase in value for a guy like Sam Laporta. Happy to have him. I have him on a team with Jared Goff, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jahmyr Gibbs. I have a huge Lions stack and been trying to tear down from Sam Laporta, but nobody really wants to tear down on Sam Laporta this year. Additionally, Dak Prescott, he's one of my favorite values right now in Dynasty startups. I have 1 share of Dak. Wish I had a little bit more. But it seems like the people that have him don't necessarily want to sell him for the price that he's going for in startups right now. And then I have some AJ Brown, who I think is a little bit undervalued this year. And then Jonathan Taylor, who is a guy that I've been buying this offseason, kind of getting him in startups and in the trade market. And I think Jonathan Taylor needs to be in the same type of conversation as guys like Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, those types. He's not being drafted as such, so he just feels like such a good value that I'm getting a couple more shares. And you see that 50% exposure shows that I kind of have a little bit more exposure to a guy like Jonathan Taylor. Now, in the 4th round, that's where it gets a little bit of a larger list. I'm a little bit more spread out across this entire group of players in ADP. Now, there is one player that consistently stands out, and you'll see it right there in the middle of the screen. 70% exposure to a guy like Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Aiyuk is a guy that last offseason, I made a video on this channel where I talked about dynasty darlings, players I could not stop drafting, players I could not stop trading for last offseason when Brandon Aiyuk was at an ADP of 70. That paid out pretty well. I have a lot of Brandon Aiyuk now. Now, a lot of people do not really want to buy Brandon Aiyuk at this price, but I don't mind because I am very much a fan of Brandon Aiyuk. He had a massive value increase over the last year or so. I think it is going to kind of stay put, at least at this range for a little while. Maybe he gets down a little bit in ADP, but I never see him going back to that 70 range of ADP where he was when I first invested in him. So Brandon Aiyuk, he stands out a lot, but he's a guy that I am heavily invested in my Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues. Now, the rest of this is kind of spread out. You have guys like Romo Dunze, JJ McCarthy, Dalton Kincaid. These were all players that I have added in rookie drafts over the last couple of years. And then you have guys like Jared Goff, who I just traded for yesterday, a guy like like Trey McBride, who I bought low on last offseason, and guys like Jalen Waddle and Michael Pittman Jr., who I feel confident as wide receiver 2s for my rosters. Now, in round 5, I don't really have a lot of exposure to any of these players. It's ones across the board for me, but you have guys like DJ Moore, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Kenneth Walker. I don't feel very strong about any of these players. I guess the only player that I feel the best about in this cluster of guys is Mark Andrews. And I think Mark Andrews, he is a guy that probably has a couple more years under his belt where he can still give you these top 5 numbers at the tight end position. I love Travis Kelce. I think Travis Kelce is legendary. He probably doesn't have a ton of time left, but on a contending roster, I'm more than happy to have a guy like Travis Kelce. DJ Moore, the added target competition. Kenneth Walker, kind of liked the guy coming in as a rookie, but he just hasn't really lived up to the hype that I felt like he should have. And for the most part, he's a guy that I feel like is more so a running back 2 on my lineups, and I think he's probably a little bit overpriced by the community. But for the most part, everybody who is valued below Kenneth Walker, I'm thinking guys like James Cook, Rashad White, even guys like Joe Mixon. Most people don't really want to tier up into a guy like Kenneth Walker and pay the cost of what it would be to kind of go get a guy like Kenneth Walker. So because of this, he's kind of just stuck on my roster where I do have him in one place. Now, in the 6th round, it's a little bit similar to that 4th round, kind of spread out, kind of a lot of exposure across a whole bunch of different guys. There's a couple guys here that I think have wide receiver 2 upside that are probably being drafted as wide receiver 3s. Those are guys like DK Metcalf and T. Higgins. You also have some young guys that I don't mind taking shots on. You see, I have 2 shares of a guy like Jordan Addison, drafted him in a lot of rookie drafts last year. I have Xavier Worthy, who I drafted in a rookie draft this year, and then I have Jackson Smith and Jigba as well, who I also drafted in a rookie draft. So kind of getting those young talents in those rookie drafts and kind of seeing where they pan out. Guys like Jordan Addison, Xavier Worthy, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. This is kind of the roster exposure that I have to them. You have a guy like Rashad White, who, again, he's a running back that I think I kind of bought low on last offseason. He overperformed for the most part. He got a ton of volume. I think he can put up probably high-end RB2 numbers again this year. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with Dave Canales out of that offense. And then you have the quarterbacks, and a guy that I've talked about a lot last offseason going into rookie drafts, and a guy that I have bought a lot of this offseason, Bryce Young. I had him. I sold him. I bought him back. There's a lot of moving and grooving with a guy like Bryce Young on my rosters. I currently have 2 shares. I used to have 3 shares of them, I think. I sold Bryce Young in one deal to kind of just limit that exposure. I didn't want to be overexposed to a guy like Bryce as much as I do believe in him. And then you have a Kirk Cousins share that, hey, he was a Minnesota Viking at one point, and now he's kind of just sitting on my roster. And he tore the Achilles, so it's kind of hard to trade a guy like Kirk Cousins. But I'll hold him because that roster is a competitive roster, and maybe Kirk Cousins has a good year here with the Atlanta Falcons. Now, I was interested to see that in round 7, I really don't have anybody currently at this ADP. Only a couple of guys right now. And one of them is a guy that I got in a rookie draft in Trey Benson. The other is a guy in Stephon Diggs, who I've had for many years on a competitive roster when he was in Buffalo. I won 2 championships with that roster, and Stephon Diggs has kind of just found his way down this roster over time. Now he currently sits at this ADP. But one guy that I have traded for at this ADP this offseason, Jake Ferguson. I moved Cole Kmet in a league to get Jake Ferguson. It was pretty much a lateral move at this point. Feel very good about that going into this year because I think Jake Ferguson is a guy who has kind of tight end 1 potential in this offense next to CeeDee Lamb because there really is no other receiving threats in this offense with Dak Prescott. Now, round 8 is interesting because of the 12 ADP slots, I have about 9 of these guys. So you have guys like Brian Thomas Jr., a young wide receiver, Jayden Reed, same thing, Lad McConkey, even a guy like Rashee Rice, who I bought low on this offseason when he kind of had some of the off the field issues. All of these guys are guys that are kind of high upside shots for me, but you see Brian Thomas Jr., you see Lad McConkey, you see Jayden Reed. I drafted all of these guys in rookie drafts, and I drafted Jayden Reed in a couple places last year. I'm feeling very good about that right now. I don't believe that Jayden Reed is a sell high. A lot of people in the community believe that Jayden Reed is a sell high type of wide receiver. I firmly believe that this is the wide receiver 1 for the Green Bay Packers moving forward, and I'm more than confident holding these 2 shares of Jayden Reed at his current ADP. Now, the rest of this tier is a couple of the older running backs, some older wide receivers, older tight ends. You have guys like Henry, Mixon, Kittle, Evans. Those are all guys that I currently have on contending rosters. I bought Derrick Henry as my RB2 on a contending roster. Joe Mixon, he's my RB2 on a contending roster. And then kind of similar situations with George Kittle and Mike Evans. And then I have 1 Baker Mayfield share. I think at this time last year, I had 3 shares of Baker Mayfield. I have since sold off quite a few of them. And now I only have that 1 share of Baker Mayfield left. And that is on a team with Mike Evans. So I do have that Tampa Bay stack. Now, round 9 here, similar to round 7, not a lot of players that I have exposure to. There's guys like Cole Kmet, Amari Cooper, Chris Godwin. I just don't feel very strong about any of these guys. I'm actually probably a little bit lower on Cole Kmet than I have been in years past right now. Amari Cooper, I think he's fine on a contending roster, which that's where I have him in this league. But other than that, I'm not really too excited to have him. And Chris Godwin feels like an asset that is pretty dead in the community right now. Not a lot of people want to buy Chris Godwin. I don't necessarily want to roster Chris Godwin. I know that there's a lot of rumors about him potentially moving to the slot and getting more usage here in 2024. We'll see what happens. I just sold off a Chris Godwin share just a week ago or so. So kind of getting out of the Chris Godwin when I can. I don't know if this is going to make it into week 1 on my roster where he currently sits. And then the last and final round right here, round 10, we do have a couple other assets, and a lot of these are going to be guys that I've drafted in rookie drafts as well. Rookie draft selections: Ricky Pearsall, Tajay Spears, Adonai Mitchell. Those are kind of the guys that we have. And then some veterans that I'm a little bit higher on than most, I think. I have Najee Harris right now. I can't really get him anywhere else for the most part, which is funny because I feel like a lot of people want to sell Najee Harris, but for whatever reason, my league mates don't want to sell me Najee Harris, but I do have Najee there. And then Calvin Ridley, bought him for a second round pick in 2025. Just added him to a contending roster for depth. Diontae Johnson, I am higher on than most. I have 2 shares. You see 50% of my exposure. I think he bounces back up to that wide receiver 2 type of production here with Bryce Young. That is also kind of baking into the fact that you guys saw I am heavily invested in Bryce Young. I have Diontae Johnson where I am invested in Bryce Young as well. I'm kind of banking on this breakout from these two with Dave Canales here in Carolina this year. So kind of one of my bets that I am making in my leagues. And then Adonai Mitchell, he's another guy that I have some exposure to that's higher than most. This is a guy that I believed in a lot coming into the NFL. Not really getting the draft capital that I thought he would get. I thought this was a guy that could go in the first round to Buffalo, Kansas City, maybe the early second round to a Los Angeles Chargers. That didn't really happen for Adonai Mitchell. He did fall. He goes to the Colts. I think this is still a fine spot for Adonai Mitchell. And because of that, he fell in my rookie drafts, and I was able to take a couple extra shares of Adonai Mitchell than I had originally planned to. And then I have a guy like Aaron Jones. I had him when he was on the Green Bay Packers. He goes to the Minnesota Vikings. Not a lot of people want to trade for Aaron Jones, and that roster should be contending here in 2024. And he's a Minnesota Viking, so I guess I'll hold 1 share of Aaron Jones. So let's take a look at this rostership insights right here. This will kind of give us a picture of how I am constructing my rosters. You see, early on in drafts, in that 1 to 24 range, in that 1 to 50 range, I'm taking the majority of my quarterbacks, especially because, like I said, these are super flex leagues. So I'm building my roster around these quarterbacks. And I should mention all of these are 6-point passing touchdown as well. So it gives a little bit of a boost to the QBs as well. Now, when it comes to the running backs, I do think this is a little bit skewed. You see that 1 to 24 ADP. We have 27% of that. That was because I drafted guys in the rookie draft like Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan Robinson, those types of running backs, and they found their way into this ADP range. I did not invest in them at this range, but you see the majority of the running backs that I am investing in are in that 100 to 300 ADP. So I'm kind of waiting a long time to start investing in these running backs, but when I do, I take a lot of them at 39%. Now, the wide receivers, this is interesting because in that 1 to 24 range, I'm not getting a lot of the elite wide receivers, but that's because I'm taking those quarterbacks in that range. But when you have the 1 to 50, the 1 to 100, the 50 to 100, you see, we are smashing the wide receiver position in the middle rounds, the early-ish to middle-ish rounds of these startup drafts, and it's giving us very, very solid wide receiver room. So we're kind of getting that early and often, and we really don't get away from it. We just load up on the wide receiver position for the most part. And then the tight end position, this is very interesting because everything is pretty much dispersed. There is no rhyme or reason as to where I am investing in these guys and why I'm investing in these guys at this cost. Now, I will say you have that 1 to 50 ADP. I probably would not normally have it at 12%, but because I drafted Kincaid, because I traded low on a guy like Trey McBride, and because I drafted Sam Laporta, that is going to skew that early ADP because all of those guys have moved up in ADP over the last year or so. So it is kind of pushing that ADP percentage up in that type of range. But a majority of the tight ends that I have invested in are the Cole Kmet, Jake Ferguson, Pat Freiermuth type of tight ends that do typically sit within that 50 to 100 or even that 100 to 300 ADP. So there you guys have it. A little bit of an interesting video. We usually talk about your guys' teams, your questions, strategy, trades, all of that good stuff. Today we talked about my teams and what I'm actually doing in my Dynasty Fantasy Football League. So hopefully you guys found that interesting. Hopefully there were some takeaways for that for you guys so you could at least see how I am constructing my rosters and maybe use the way that I am doing it to help construct your rosters in a similar way. But if you did enjoy today's video, go ahead and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you guys are hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way you guys get notified every time we upload upload a new video and you never miss any of them when they come out. And last but not least, make sure you go join the Discord. We are doing a Dynasty trade show this upcoming week. So if you want some Dynasty Fantasy Football trades submitted into that Discord and reviewed by me and my co-host on Let's Talk Dynasty this week, make sure you go submit them into the Dynasty Trade Review channel in our Discord. And like I said, it is free to join that Discord. There is no risk in doing that, and we have an awesome community here at the League FFB. So with all of that out of the way, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.